This is a picture of Napoleon Bonaparte. On the right side of the picture there is a man in a turban. This is Rustam, Napoleon's bodyguard. He served as Napoleon's bodyguard for 15 years. He even slept at the door of Napoleon's room for his protection. He was constantly next to Napoleon, which is why you can spot him on so many paintings of Napoleon, especially those depicting battles. Rustam was an Armenian Mamluk whom Napoleon brought back from his campaign in Egypt. It is about Mamluks we will be talking about in this video. Rustam was born into an Armenian family in Tbilisi. As a child, he was kidnapped during the war in the region, eventually taken to Egypt, where he became a Mamluk. In 1799, he entered Napoleon's service at the age of 17 and remained at his side for the next 15 years, becoming one of the most recognizable figures of the imperial court. Mamluks were a military caste made out of slave soldiers who ruled Egypt and the huge part of Middle East for several centuries. At some point, they even established a state in the Middle East, in which Caucasians played a big part. In this video, we'll talk about the Mamluks and the general involvement of North Caucasians in the history of Middle East. You will learn, for example, how an Abkhazian man became the Prime Minister of Tunisia, helped write its constitution, and even ended up on their money. And also, why one of the Prime Ministers of UK had a Circassian roots. And also, why Leonardo da Vinci may have had a Circassian mother. And also, why the inspiration behind the army of Ansalid in the Game of Thrones could have been Turkish and Circassian slave soldiers. The Mamluks were slave soldiers who served in the medieval Middle East. The term Mamluk itself means the one who is owned. It referred to a slave who was specifically recruited and trained for military purposes. The story of the Mamluks begins in the 9th century when the rulers of Abbasid Caliphate began purchasing young boys from the Turkic tribes of Central Asia and the Caucasus region. These boys were sold into military service and raised within a strict, secluded system of training. They lived inside barracks, separated from the rest of the population. There they learned discipline, horsemanship, and mastery of arms, eventually turned into one of the most elite soldiers of their time. Over the generations, Mamluk warriors became the backbone of the armies that employed them. This was the case for the Ayyubid dynasty, the realm founded by the famous Saladin. However, these soldiers eventually realized their own power. In 1250, following the death of the last Ayyubid Sultan, they seized control of Egypt for themselves. The Mamluk state lasted from 1250 to 1517 and can be divided into two periods: the Bahri, or Turkic state, and the Burji, the Circassian state. I myself come from the North Caucasus, and which is why in this video I will be leaning more into the story of the Circassians and North Caucasians in general within the Mamluk state. From their capital in Cairo, the Mamluks built a formidable state that lasted for over 2.5 centuries. They famously defeated the Crusaders during the 7th Crusade and eventually drove them out of the Levant completely, dismantling the final 3 Crusader states. And most notably, the Mamluks were the ones who finally halted the Mongol invasion of the Middle East at the Battle of Anjalut, something which is incredibly rare at that time. The Mamluk legacy is still visible today in the skyline and architecture of many Middle Eastern cities, but especially in Cairo. Welcome to the story of Mamluks, the warriors who conquered their masters and built an empire from the chains of servitude. And just to clarify the geography of the state, so there was Ayyubid state in Egypt and Syria in the 13th century. It ended in 1250 and got replaced by Mamluk Sultanate. Mamluk Sultanate lasted for almost 3 centuries, 2.5 centuries. It spread over today's Egypt and Syria, and also Hijaz. It controlled Jerusalem and Mecca and Medina for a long period of time as well. This is Abbasid state right next to it. It was at the end of it because of the Mongolian invasion. And these are the Crusader states right here. Today we will be talking to Professor Bethany Walker from University of Bonn, Professor Albrecht Fuess from University of Marburg, and Professor Koby Yosef from Bahri University.
So in the 9th century, the Abbasid state decided that it might be wiser to experiment with a new military system that would guarantee loyalty to the head of state rather than loyalty to the local population. And there's nothing more loyal than soldiers that come from somewhere else. So those that you bring from abroad as slaves, use them in the army, and they are loyal units. And from that point on, then from the Abbasid period on, there has been a Mamluk core to most Muslim militaries from that point on, and not only Islamic states. We have something similar in the Byzantine state. We certainly have it in Southeast Asia, and it's spread far and wide, and it's stayed for centuries and centuries, again, for the key purpose of loyalty. These are soldiers that owe everything to the state and to the individual that manumits them if they are manumitted.
How does a boy how does he become a Mamluk?
The system in the 9th century is very different than it was in the Mamluk Sultanate. In the Mamluk Sultanate, slaves entered the military through a couple of ways. A captives war. So during wartime, men are collected, they're enslaved, and they serve in the army. And then we think of a classical system where they go through Islamic training, and they're eventually converted to Islam and are manumitted. But the history isn't so straightforward. The early Mamluk period is different from the late Mamluk period. Manumission wasn't automatic in the early decades of the Mamluk period. There was another way that men ended up becoming slave soldiers, and that was rather voluntarily. So families in need sold off their young sons to give them career opportunities and opportunities they couldn't get at home. And that became more and more common in the later centuries, the later period of Mamluk rule in Cairo. And you have something similar in other states as well. So you have the Genoese that are doing the transporting. You have trade treaties with them, with the Golden Horde as well. And you have to make sure that the ports and the straits are open, and that trade doesn't stop, and that the transport doesn't stop. And many people made a lot of money off of it. So it was an international affair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On a big scale.
On a big scale. Yeah. As far as how big, I can't give you numbers. I wouldn't even know how to begin to quantify that. There have been studies that have been done of that.
And it lasted for 1,000 years, right?
Yeah.
From 9th century till 19th century, right?
In one form or another, with different partners, yes.
But it was mostly focused on Central Asia, or do you know where was it, like the main focal points of origins? For example, I heard it's steppes of today's Kazakhstan and southern Russia, Central Asia, and Northern Caucasus are normally highlighted as focal points of origins.
Right.
Is that so? Yeah.
It was definitely for the 13th and 14th centuries, but trade routes changed. And keep in mind that the reason that region became a focal point is because people were available. They were being pushed, they had been pushed west because of the Mongol conquests initially, and where you had migrant populations and people on the move, those people were vulnerable. They were invulnerable to enslavement, to captivity of various forms, and could be easily grabbed, and there was nobody looking after them and looking after their rights. So yes, changes in trade routes and also changes in the international system and politics had some role to play as well. So for us, for the Mamluk period, we're looking at the Kipchak steppe, and we're looking at the Northern Caucasus, certainly. But that focus changes in different periods depending on trade routes and where peoples are available.
So coming to Mamluk Sultanate, we have, starting in 9th, 10th century, we have Mamluks in slaves becoming high-ranking military officers in several Islamic states. And then how do they come to power themselves in Mamluk Sultanate? How does this
Yeah.
happens?
Okay. Many states had units that were in their armies that were of slave background. That was widespread. The Byzantines had it. The Delhi Sultanate had it. There were states that and every Muslim state had some version of that, including the Ottomans with the Janissaries. But the role that those units played differed from state to state. What makes the Mamluk Sultanate rather special is that they took over power and stayed in power. In the Delhi Sultanate is founded by a former slave soldier, but what happens in terms of transfer of power is very different there than it is with the Mamluk Sultanate. In the Mamluk Sultanate, it's still this system of the best among equals, kind of like Roman style, where that person comes to power because he's able to and because of the agreement of his peers. And you have slave soldiers. Not all of the sultans, though, were slaves. Nasser Muhammad was not. He was the son of a sultan, so we have some exceptions. But by and large, those sultans had a slave background. But it wasn't only their slave status that brought them to power. There were many other things, many more important things, the relationships with their peers, the khoshtashia, the sense of brotherhood, and their status, but mostly marital ties, being married into the previous sultan's family. So those kinds of marital and blood ties were important too.
Is this the only example in history or at that time of a slave-run, basically, state?
The Sultanate of Delhi was established by a slave soldier, but the people that followed him were not always of that background. So you have family members that come to power, other members of the military that come to power. That's different than what happens with the Mamluk Sultanate. Those are, by and large, slave soldiers, and one replaces the next. So that's a unique system.
So it's a uniqueness in that sense that their identity was tied to their slave origin, and they couldn't establish a dynasty like one or two tried, and they succeeded in short-term dynasties that lasted for 3-4 generations. But by and large, the group identity was linked to their status of them being Mamluks. So that's a unique.
I would say that's unique.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the only factor. Keep in mind that this intermarriage and family ties, ethnicity comes to play as well. Not all Mamluks of different ethnic backgrounds were equal in the system. So if non-Turks or ones that entered the system because they were captives of war didn't necessarily have the same status as those that were recruited as slave soldiers through a different system.
The Turkish military slavery, which is the interesting point here, got initiated around the 9th century in Baghdad and Samarra, so in the Abbasid Caliphate, in order to get rid of other ethnicities, or the caliphs wanted to have a strong force which is independent from his Arab tribes and the Persian military he had. So they were meant to counter this. And once the system was started, it was kept on because it proved quite successful. So people would buy Turkish boys, young age, bring them to Samarra, Baghdad, and then train them. And then they become soldiers, so really professional soldiers to enter the military. And usually the process, and the Mamluks did the same, is that actually once you enter the military, your slavery status ends. So you get a certificate, so-called itaka, which then makes you a free person. But the problem is you're not free to go back home or whatever you are. You're just free to enter the military. But once you enter the military, you're not a slave anymore. So that is also very decisive for the status, because it's not that slaves actually ruled, but the slavery status for most of these Mamluks was when they were sold to slavery, so at a very early age, until they ended their military service. And then we have some very interesting details or something that somebody has a wrong certificate when he was freed. So 20 years later, they find out, oh, we have some legal issues with your with your freedom, you're actually still a slave, although the guy is now a commander. So they have to do this again and let him free. Yeah.
So does that mean that if he wants to retire early, for example, can he go into like trade or anything else? Can he change profession and just be a civilian?
For the first generation of Mamluks, this is impossible. There's no civil life for them. But there are, of course, they have relationships with civil families once they marriage. Maybe their children marry into the local elites and other things. But the first generation really comes and stays in the military service until the very end, or until they cannot fight anymore and they have to retreat. So there's no way out for them. And the advantage as well for the state is that you have a really a professional soldiers there, like elite, which we have in all pre-modern societies. And here the advantage as well is, if you have people like coming from different countries and slavery, is that they don't have a local stronghold. So they cannot become a prince of a region or something. And that is something which was very important for the rulers, to have soldiers which were loyal, completely loyal to them, and also loyal to the state, but they had no actual idea to become a dynasty themselves. And that makes it very intriguing. Yeah.
They didn't have any other allegiance except their owner, the Sultan. So
they had no, and first of all, at the beginning, they didn't knew anyone. They did not know people. They just know other soldiers, the people who trained with them. And until they really become mature, and usually they don't marry until 40 or 35. So this is for a second part of their life, so that they become political. Before, they're really like this trained extreme soldiers, and very efficient in archery, and horse riding, all kinds of furusiya, this military technique. So they are really great in that. And then the point why they then initiated or took the power, we would say, in Egypt itself, is then the story about 1250 and the attack of the French king on Alexandria.
So just to continue with the slavery. So just to go into more detail, the Black Sea slave trade. So how big of an establishment was it, and how important was it in this establishing this flow of young boys from that region, North Caucasus and Kipchak steppe, the further east. So how it was established, and as far as I understand, it was like a giant corporation which involved a couple of states, and it was involved letters from heads of states, so that those merchants would be safe to travel for those merchants in different countries, through different countries. So.
Yeah. So the slave trade in general, not only the slave trade for these young boys who became military slaves, but also for private slavery, is huge in that period. I mean, all over the world. There's no exception. It's not only the Muslim period, Muslim realm. It's slavery is a normal point of human history. So you have household slavery, and you have this military slavery, especially in the Islamic world. And then at a certain point, they said, we need people from more or less the Caucasus or the steppe, because they said we need especially horse riders. So they were looking for skills for young boys who could already were trained horse riders when they bought them. And one of the big, or I would say central points here is also the Mongol advance, which triggered these trade even bigger, because the Mongols made so many captured so many people, so we had a huge amount of slaves available, and especially people who were also able to horse ride. So from Central Asia to the Caucasus and to the northern Caspian region and North Black Sea region, the Kipchak steppe, you had in the 13th century, beginning of the 13th century, a huge influx of horse riding people. So really thousands, 100,000s of people coming, flooding these regions, and coming with the Mongol military. And they made captives, or they made captives in between. There were a lot of people to sell. And they then come into a region which is already looking for these people, because the military slavery of Turks has become institutionalized since the 9th century. And now this demand has a huge offer. Yeah. And that brings both sides quite positively together. Now, what were the usually trading routes? Where it was already established from Central Asia, Caucasus, through Iran, then going down to Egypt, for example. But what happened now as well is that you had Byzance was always, Constantinople was part of this slave trade before, but they were usually a bit reluctant as well, because they wanted to protect themselves against Turkish, the Seljuks and others. So when then in 1204 the Venetians captured Constantinople in the Crusade, which actually wanted to go to Jerusalem, but made a first step in Constantinople and conquered Constantinople, suddenly Venice was controlling the straits of the Black Sea. And having with this also access to the resources of the Black Sea, and the Genoese as well. And so the Italian seafaring nations actually entered the Black Sea. They had the boats in north of the Black Sea, in Kaffa, in a big city in on the Crimea, was a hub for slavery market. So win-win situation. These Italians brought then the slaves to the Mamluk Empire. Although there was a ban on slavery, the Pope said, no, you should not sell slaves, military slaves, to Muslim emperors. I mean, the Genoese didn't mind. The Venetians were a bit more reluctant, but then there were smuggling routes and all of these things. So you had in somehow now an intertwining of the Mongolian advance with a lot of offer of slaves, especially Kipchaks, Turks north of the Black Sea. You had the means by the Italian seafaring nations, which knew how to do it on ship. And you had the offer, you had the Cairo and Alexandria who wanted to have these slaves. And so they come back down. So one of these big issues is to have the trading route from the Black Sea to Alexandria open. And besides that, you always had inland routes as well. So you had the route going through from the Caucasus, then through Iran, going down. But these are more difficult. Sometimes political things are there, Bedouins, wars, and other things. Or what also happened is that the trade route, especially Venetians, for example, as they were forbidden to bring slaves to the Mamluks, and the Pope was still looking a bit, then they resorted, they bringing the slaves just on the other side of the Black Sea to Trabzon. Okay. Which at the time is Byzantine, but under some control of the Ilkhanids. So, and from them you can take the landway. So, because from there to Aleppo, it's not very far. So the whole issue is there, and the European seafaring nations are taking a big part, winning a lot of money with these military slave trade, and so it opens up.
So these slaves come to Cairo, and at the time it's Ayyubid dynasty.
Yeah.
It's 1250, as you said, and there's a battle. The French king Louis IX is in the Seventh Crusade, and the elite army of the Ayyubid dynasty in Cairo is Mamluks. So that's when they take over. So could you go on that?
Yeah. So you have a Saleh Ayyub as the last Ayyubid Sultan, and he's fighting off Louis IX, the French king, and or the Holy Saint Louis, and then he actually dies in the camp in Mansoura. So the fact is, now who is going to be succeeding him? And that is a decisive point, of course. Always, if an old sultan dies, who becomes the new sultan? So he has this his wife Shajar ad-Dur, also a military slave, or not military slave, but a slave, a former slave. And so they decide to hide that he's dead for some while. So they just put him on the throne and say, no, he's still there, and we're talking to him and these things. But at a certain point, then it becomes clear that actually he died. So okay, so they ask his son Turan Shah to come from northern Syria and to take over the rule. And actually, he does this. He comes from there. But a problem arises as well, is that he brings his own military with him, and he wants to replace the military of his father. And so there's struggle between these both militaries, and the struggle is won by the old Mamluks of his father, and they kill him. And they kill Turan Shah, the son of their former master, which is not nice. And then comes something which is called the Law of the Turks. That's how we read it in the Arabic sources, which means that whoever kills the old sultan becomes the new sultan. But they are still in somehow not clear what they should do. Yeah, because they said, okay, but we are Turks. We are still not. We were former slaves. Should we rule ourselves? So they make a compromise. They said, okay, we have killed him, but the new sultan will be a wife, the wife of Saleh Ayyub, by name Shajar ad-Dur. And this is also Turkish Central Asian tradition. There's no problem for the widow to become a sultana. Whereas for the Arab Mamluk region, this is difficult, and there's a lot of protest by the Arab people and the whole society. So then they marry her with a Sultan Aybak, a Mamluk, and then a lot of other problems arises from this. And there's even a huge Egyptian movie from the 1950s depicting all these things. I think it's Islam or Islama, and that's really very all details. Aybak, or she has him killed, then she is killed, and suddenly then there is inner strifes. One sultan at the end emerges by name of Qutuz.
Let's go back briefly to the map. So in 1250, the Mamluk Sultanate is established. It stretches from Egypt and Hijaz to Syria. Right next to it is Abbasid Caliphate. To the right to Abbasid Caliphate, this is Mongol Empire. And it stretches all the way to the east. At the Mediterranean Sea, there are three Crusader states which have been there for 150 years already. Principality of Antioch, County of Tripoli, and Kingdom of Jerusalem. So these are not new states, they have been there for a long time. If we move a little bit further, we can see that soon after, Abbasid Caliphate has been taken over by Mongols. And then later, Mamluk state, one by one, takes over Crusader states and ends Crusader presence in the Middle East. So these states have been there for a long time, and now they're gone. What I also want to show is how actually close Mamluk state was to North Caucasus. You can see that from the northern point of it to the North Caucasus is really not so far, and it's really not so far to Georgia. Qutuz becomes the first so it's a Mamluk ruler, and then is followed by Baybars, and then they together as well are victors over Mongols soon after they win over Crusaders. And it's these two victories help them establish their dynasty, or their legitimize their power. Yeah, how did that occur?
Yeah. So so first of all, as you said, I mean, we have the victory against the Crusaders at Mansoura on one point, and then we have this very huge Mongol advance on the Near and Middle East. And so there has been some inner strifes between the Mamluks under Qutuz, and some under Baybars went to Syria, but they reconciled and say we have to fight together the Mongols. And this leads to the battle at Ain Jalut in Palestine in 1258, where the Mamluks actually win this very decisive battle against the Mongols, which is also quite interesting because this is in somehow they have similar fighting techniques, and maybe that is also so Central Asian fighting techniques, and that is maybe also one of the points why the Mamluks were able to win, because they were so they knew how the Mongols would act, and because they had this very high-reaching and very good archery. That is the point where they win, because they knew how to position themselves. And on the way back, actually, then Qutuz celebrates his victory and gets killed by Baybars. And Baybars becomes the new sultan, and he emerges as the sultan in 1260, who actually then initiates all the reforms and the ways the Mamluk Empire will go from that period on. And I think also that the big victory against the Mongols, and that they have defeated the Crusaders before, and they are still keeping to push out the rest of the Crusader states, helps them for their legacy tremendously, because now they are the one who saved Islam in their own propaganda, but this is also seen by others in the region. And they also take a survivor of the Abbasid Caliphate. They take him into Cairo and put him on the throne there, where he becomes the shadow caliph. So actually, Cairo is now the new capital of Islam in the eyes of the Mamluks themselves. They, as sultan, are still upholding the rule for the caliph. So the caliph is actually, he has no power, but he is the one who is legitimizing the Mamluk rule, so they can still go on with these being slaves and slave soldiery. So I think that's quite important on the ideological bit. And they are the strongest fighters of their time. So they have thought of the biggest enemies Islam ever saw, the Mongols and the Crusaders. And this, for the 12th and 13th and then 14th century, this is their ideological background.
So for the context, Mongols are taking over the whole continent, whole Eurasia, basically, and they don't lose, right? They don't. And that's not often they lose, and the Mamluks are the first ones to stop them, right? So that's what. That's why it's so important.
That's why it's so important. I think there are several issues to that. The Mongol army, first of all, like all big successes, of course, at a certain point, they overstretch their forces at a certain point, so they're quite really far away from home. There have now been some inner struggles in Karakorum, so in the Mongol capital. So Hülagü, who actually leads the attack into Iraq and Syria, he gets called back home because they are inner. Now we need a new ruler after the death of the old Khan. And so that is one point. So the Mongols are not that strong at that point, and also the Mongols rely mainly on their horse forces. So what they have as a real advantage is that every Mongol soldier has 3 to 4 horses with them. So they attack with 1 horse, go back, take a 2nd horse, go back, hold the 3rd horse, hold the 4th horse. And the defenders are just like completely exhausted because these people never stop. Because it's, in other armies, you have 1 or maximum 2 horses, and after 2-3 hours, the horses are ready. But these people never, they just like come wave after wave after wave. And so but for these tactics, you also need the terrain. So you need the steppe, you need everything. And then now coming at the border to Palestine and then also to Egypt, now it becomes very desert and these things. So for these terrains, these tactic is a bit more difficult to go on, because also for 4 horses, desert is a desert. And so it's quite exhausting. And that is then what you see. And the Mamluks are more concise. They rely a lot on their horses, but they rely also on their military training in terms of, as said before, they are these professional archers, and they really know what to do with their horses. And so they are smaller, but within the terrain they fight in, they know the terrain much better, and then they are able to overcome this Mongol threat, which is not as strong as it used to be. But of course, already that they have the first one who won against them, that makes it so important.
So you have these 3 powers. You have Crusaders in the Middle East. There's several Crusader states, and the Mongols come, and they actually negotiating with each other, all 3 of them. To it's not clear if who will be allies. The Crusaders, the Christian states trying to ally themselves with Mongols, and then they have ongoing negotiations, this on and off relationship with Mamluks as well. But in the end, Mamluk
Al-Ashraf Khalil, Ibn Qalawun.
So Qalawun. Yeah, he was the one who sieged Akka, right?
Akka in 1293.
Yeah. So how did that happen? Was it inevitable that they were gonna fight, and how to phrase it? The relationship with them, would it inevitably lead to that, to the end of the Crusaders?
I think at the end it was quite the natural way, I would say, which was started by Salahuddin ibn Ayyub, the unification, we say, of the Arab Muslim world. I think at the end it was quite the natural way, I would say, which was started by Salahuddin ibn Ayyub, the unification, we say, of the Arab Muslim world around the Crusader states, as a term of to get rid of these states in a certain point. And the Mamluks are heirs to that, especially because they now control, as heirs of the Ayyubids, they control Egypt and Syria. And so the Crusader states are like an island within their realm, which doesn't help. They see it as difficult. Then there is this point which was raised by you, that the Crusader states are looking for alliances with the Mongols against the Mamluks. There is this legend among the Christian states that the Mongols were actually a Christian tribe. And the Christian king, the Prester John legend, which does not hold, but still Prester John, somebody will come from the east, from the Oriental Christians, and help the Christians to survive. So this is, of course, a danger for the Mamluks if they want to keep Syria against the Mongol Ilkhanate territory in Iraq. They cannot really afford to have a foe in their back, which the Crusader states are. So the logical means is also to purge the coast, especially also to get into hands all questions of trade and other things which are heavily dominated by the Italian seafaring nations. For that, they have to learn how to do siege. So Baibars becomes much better in using siege instruments and besieging the coast. And then they actually really manage to get one city after the other until Akka is falling.
Is that important in this in their fight? Is it important that Mamluks are also kind of like a knights? So you have Crusader knights and you have knights. It's like a military elite, the horse riding, heavily armed.
Yeah, I mean that's important, but you always had that. So the Mamluks are making it much more efficient. They are really very trained things, and of course you have to adjust to your military foe. I mean, the Crusaders are very heavily armed, and the Mamluks are much more flexible. So they are not the armory is not that heavy, and so they can come and go and these kind of things. So it's a different sort of technique. But I think what we see is that the Mamluk state is investing heavily into the military to get rid of the Crusaders and also to fight off the Mongols, and that also leads to an economical upheaval. So we have a very good economic situation after the 1270s, 1280s. We see that, and we see in Cairo huge buildings are built, also in memory of the victory against the Crusaders. Like An-Nasr Muhammad has his madrasa. You have the Cathedral of Akka. The door is brought from Akka to Cairo and put there, and also the Mustashfa Kalawun, the hospital of Kalawun. If you go inside, it looks like the Dome of the Rocks. So so you have these things, and also to show the people of Cairo that actually we have won against the Crusaders. So because it's one thing to say we have these victories, but also in the urban landscape of Cairo, this victory is mirrored in the architecture.
But also probably it also helped is the spoils so far. The victory, the victor takes everything.
Yes.
For example, when they captured the King of France, he had to pay huge amount of money.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course, the looting and the spoils and this helps also, and so the Mamluk state until the mid 14th century actually sees very large activities in all building activities, better agriculture, a lot of reforms are done to make the state really running. Then after these victories.
I think it was absolutely critical. The eastern frontier couldn't have been defended any other way. The Mongols would have pushed all the way to the sea, and there was some evidence to that there were no end to the ambitions of Mongol expansion. So that was critical. Just like it was critical to conquer once and for all the Crusaders. There was not going to be a safe, united Syria and Egypt under Mamluk control and safety of the pilgrimage routes to Mecca, unless that the western frontier and the eastern frontier were secured. So Angelut was critical.
Their ethnicity and to their background. In Mamluk Sultanate, we have two dynasties. They are normally called Turkic dynasty or Bahrites, and Burjites, who are Circassian dynasty.
Right.
Does that name come? That name comes from historians calling them that way. Was it important for them? Was it in any way important to them that they have this their roots? So did they call themselves Circassians?
You're asking about self-identity, and that's a really good question, and that's one that is of ongoing debate, and there's new scholarship on it too. Their names, their dress, and as we see through some artifacts and Mamluk art, the art reveals some aspect of self-identity that is not based on a slave origin, but it's based on something very ethnic that you can tell by the style of the hair, how long the hair is, tied in a bun in the back of the head, by the dress, by the face, the mustache, everything. There's a look and a feel that's simply not Egyptian. So there is an ethnic identity, and clearly these men wanted to be portrayed as they knew themselves to be, and not in some Egyptian or Syrian style, right? They kept their names. They have birth names that reflect those ethnic traits, and we have tribal motifs in some forms of art that don't have any parallel or any origin in local Islamic art, that must have come from place of origin, and more likely came from place of origin for the people for whom these objects were actually made. It's an ornament. It's a blazon. Should look familiar from medieval heraldry. Look like a fleur-de-lis?
Yeah, like French symbol.
It's a fleur-de-lis, but it's not a French fleur-de-lis.
Okay.
This is a 13th century and early 14th century dynastic symbol of the Qalauna dynasty of the Mamluks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So when you have this on pottery, and you'll see to the left and the right, there's partial Arabic inscriptions.
Yep.
Most of those inscriptions are military in nature. So this kind of pottery is produced for garrisons.
Okay.
And wherever officers are living. And this came from the storeroom at the Hespan Citadel.
Yeah, with the earthquake site.
Yeah, the earthquake site.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, now that's one kind of design. I want to show you something else.
Yeah.
Rosa, can I move it? Okay, I want to show you something else here. That's a little baby bowl. Then we get a large one. This is the monumental version of the same thing. So what we're missing is the stand. Take a look. Here's your fleur-de-lis.
Yeah, this
right?
Qalauna dynasty.
Qalauna dynasty.
Yeah.
You got an inscription that
Yeah.
runs around it. And then you see as a filler design that's a wasm. That's a tribal design.
Wow.
So we have combined dynastic symbols and tribal designs in the same bowl. That's visual documentation of the ethnicity right there.
Wow. So it's from the place of origin.
Yep.
This
Yep.
mark is from
Yep.
the place of origin.
I have never found any parallels for it locally in Jordan or in southern Syria anywhere. Never found any.
But we don't know where is exactly from this type of mark. Yeah.
It is a step symbol, and to be able to say where specifically, we need another art historian to do more studies and see where we get the straight parallels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it kind of looks like typical what you find in North Caucasus, and of course in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, those places as well. They have this, for example, the carpets, the symbols they do in the carpets. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Those are
It's
the
always
kinds of
something with circles or like eternity marks or so on and so on. They have a lot of them.
At this point, I'm not sure, but we do have this is a tribal mark.
Yeah, in Chechnya we have the petroglyphs. They have on the towers.
Okay.
I don't know exactly. Yeah, I can't say if it's similar, but yeah, it's the eternity, the sun symbols. It's always like squares and rounds and those kind of shapes. So if it's amazing to hear that it's all the way in pottery, Mamluk pottery.
There's no other purpose for it being there. It's used as a filler design, but you find it in some kind of vessels. You find it in metalwork. You find it in this is a kind of ceramic bowl that's imitating metalwork, right? And it serves an official purpose. This is official. This is not found in a house. It's found in the storeroom of a garrison, and it carries the heraldic blazon and the Arabic inscription. These are Arabic inscriptions that are used in documents of promotional documents when an emir gets promoted to a higher office.
Okay.
So there's sort of fragments. Some of the inscriptions are excerpts from those types of titulature. But anyhow, this is officialdom. These types of designs are found where you have Mamluk officers.
Yeah.
And for me, this is making a visual statement, okay? Loyalty to the state.
Yep.
But there's something ethnic going on here too. Where it's from, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know? It's a wasm.
Yeah.
It could be almost anywhere.
Some of them were kidnapped or sold into slavery at the age of, before the age of before they become adults. So
Right.
at age 5 or 10. But some of them, I know that one sultan in particular, I forgot his name. He didn't become slave until he was into his 20s. So what was the typical age when did they become slaves? Oh, so what I'm trying to say is, was there enough time for them to understand themselves as like to gain their own identity back home?
Very good question. All right, what is typical? I think we're starting to question our sacredly held beliefs about what is typical of the Mamluk system, because as we look more and more into the life histories of individual sultans and officers, what we're finding is that there are individual histories that contradict the system that we think was in place. It evolved. It evolved over time. It developed over time. One argument that's been made about the Circassian period is that these men that served were older when they were recruited. Some of them were actually volunteered and sold themselves into slavery because it was an opportunity. We've got something similar with the Janissaries in the Ottoman period as well. And that goes against what we think we know about recruiting of slaves, let's see, in the Bahri period, where the preference is get them while they're young, get them when they're pre-puberty, let's say 9 or 10 years old. They haven't formed any ties to family yet. They have no sense of identity. And most importantly, you've got all of these years to develop them, to give them a new identity, to train them in the military arts, to give them a sense of loyalty, a loyalty to the state and loyalty to the person that brought them to Cairo to begin with. So there may be a general pattern that in the Bahri period, there was, when recruiting was straight from the slave market, you have a choice, get someone young. And in the Circassian, or the Burji, so-called Burji period, recruitment worked a little bit differently, and you've got older men.
A lot of the time, when talking about Mamluks, it's just assumed that their ethnic origins was not so important. But in your research, you talk about you say the contrary thing. You say that no, it was important, the ethnic origins of Mamluks.
This is true. I mean, in general, let's speak in general lines, not get into too much details, because it will be a burden on the listener. So, but yeah, I mean, traditionally, scholars of the Mamluk Sultanate, researchers of the Mamluk Sultanate, did not give too much attention, or did not consider ethnicity to have been significant, or to have been very significant in comparison to other social ties of Mamluks. And this is not true only for ethnic ties, but for all ties that one may call natural, family ties, blood ties, marital ties. All these social ties were considered traditionally by Mamluk scholars, the scholars of the Mamluk Sultanate, as being less significant or not so important in comparison to the relationship that the Mamluks, that is slaves, developed between one another and between themselves and their master. Okay, which some have called, David Ayalon was one of the prominent scholars who initiated the Mamluk studies field. He even referred to a Mamluk family Okay, by that he meant the family, which is not the normal biological or consanguineal family, but that between the Mamluks and their master. Okay. However, let's say that in the last 2 decades, this opinion has been revised, and not only in concerning ethnic ties. By the way, this part was probably the last one to be revised, or the least to be revised. Okay, but now it's common knowledge that family ties, blood ties, and marital ties played a significant role in the lives of Mamluks. Okay. As for ethnicity, I would say that still it has not been considered significant enough by most scholars. Okay. I can mention only a few scholars who, in the past, even before 40 or 50 years, mentioned the significance of ethnicity, but still did not consider it as significant enough. I guess that the reason for that is that there is not much information, or at least it has been thought that there is not much information on ethnic origins of Mamluks. This probably is the main reason beyond this this lacuna in the research. And B, because David Ayalon, again, which people followed, didn't consider ethnicity to be important enough. Even treated the Mamluk Sultanate as a melting pot. Okay, Mamluks came from all over, from many regions. Let's say mainly, of course, from Central Asia, let's say Turks and Mongols, or the Golden Horde, and later Circassians or Caucasians in general. But all of them, when they arrived to the Mamluk Sultanate, they received a new identity of a Turkified Mamluk. They all received Turkish names. They learned the Turkish language, which was the lingua franca among the ruling elite of the Mamluks. And they not only forgot their origin, their ethnic origin, but also their family and culture and etc., etc. Okay, and they all melted in this pot to become an obedient servant with a Turkish identity. Okay, so that's the state of the research. But
Yeah.
if you want to stop here and direct me or ask another question, it's
Yeah,
okay.
I want to say, yeah. However, there's been research recently in yours as well that they did continue. They still had ties with their places of origins, at least in the case of Circassians. That they, for example, would take their relatives from back home, their brothers, fathers, they bring wives from there, right? It doesn't. Wouldn't that confirm that the relatives, the family ties were actually strong? They weren't completely forgotten.
Yeah, by the way, let's just make clear the Circassian period is the second sub-period of the Mamluk Sultanate between 1382 and 1517. And the first period, now normally called the Turkish period because of the dominant ethnic factor, is between 1250 and 1382. Okay? And even David Ayalon, he acknowledged the fact that in the Circassian period, family ties became more important, at least according at least towards the end of the 15th century. As for ethnicity, yes, of course, if you bring relatives from Circassia, then ethnicity plays a role. However, even at that time, according to Ayalon, when the Mamluk arrived in Egypt, then his origin was, at least his ethnic origin, was not considered important enough in the political life, in his social and political life. Okay? But, and by the way, there are references to the importance of ethnicity, general references, saying that the ethnic origin of a group plays an important political role. However, normally these statements were discarded, okay? Or at least not considered important enough. Again, mainly because it was very difficult to confirm these general statements, because there was not much, or at least it was believed that there is not much information on the ethnic origin of Mamluks. However, there is a lot of information on the ethnic origins of Mamluks. Let's say, according to my approximation, which I did a long time ago, so I don't remember if the exact number, but it's more or less like this. If we take only the Circassian period, then you have information concerning 30 or 40% of the Mamluk, which cannot be considered a small amount or small portion. Okay, but I just need to say something. In Arabic sources, what you have is normally general labels of the origin. Okay, that is, you have three or four main labels, which is Turco-Mongols, referred to as Tatars or as Turks. Okay, you don't know the exact origin of these Mamluks normally, except for rare cases. And there is what is called Circassians, but it is clear enough that Circassian is a label that refers to Caucasian people in general, or at least to people of the North Caucasus. Okay? If you want later, I can give you more details according to my research. Okay? And you have Europeans, which are labeled Franks or Rumis, that is Byzantines, Mamluks that came from the historical territories of the Byzantine Empire. Okay? But
These are nisbas, right?
yes,
Sorry.
these are nisbas, which means names of reference where the people came from. So it's a very general description of ethnic origin. Okay? However, in rare cases, you find something more specific. Okay? For example, you can find even tribes of Circassians. Okay, and you can find that someone was not actually Circassian, but an Abkhazian or a Georgian or an Alan from Ossetia. Okay, what else do we have? There is this reference to Mamluks coming from the Caucasus as Achuch in Arabic, which once upon a time I thought maybe it refers to the Obich group or language, but now I think that Christian Mauder assessment of the Achuch as belonging to the Akhbach of the Dagestan area is much more reasonable.
Wow.
Yes? So you have this also, okay? And if you go to European reports, accounts, that is, European travelers or missionaries that, or diplomats or traders that visited the Mamluk Sultanate, there you find descriptions of specific European origins of many Mamluks. Okay? In Mamluk sources, as far as I remember, the only specific information about the exact origin of a European Mamluk is concerning a Florentine Mamluk. Okay? This is what you have in the sources. However, if you examine the names given to the Mamluks, okay? This is what I discovered in my researches. This was actually the topic of my PhD, which later I developed. You can see that, again, this is in general lines with no details. You can see that names were given to Mamluks according to their ethnic origin, at least in certain periods of the Mamluk Sultanate. So, while I alone thought that the Mamluk Sultanate was a melting pot, and all the Mamluks received Turkish names, which was actually a unifying factor in their becoming an obedient servant with the Turkish identity. Still, when you follow the names given to the Mamluks, you see that although they were all, or at least almost all, Turkish names, they were given according to ethnic origin. So even if the sources do not mention the exact origin of a Mamluk, you can know in most of the cases, at least in the 15th century, what his general origin was according to his name. Okay? Which by itself is a testimony or evidence for the importance of ethnicity. Because if ethnicity was not so important, why give names according to ethnic origin? Okay? And when you start researching the sources with this information, you can find political coalition based on ethnic origin. This becomes more clear, okay? Because normally the sources are silent about that. Okay, and you can see that certain ethnic groups had certain career paths or more typical career paths. For example, Europeans were considered probably had some knowledge of firearms, or they were considered due to stereotypical thinking to be good with money. So they were given jobs that involve weapons or handling the treasury or stuff like this. And Circassians, I don't know. I didn't find something specific for the 15th century. So that's it. Treatise of in the Mamluk Sultanate, there is information on the tribes of 4 Mamluk Sultans. 2 of them were in Arabic, it's Kabka or something like this, which is probably, not sure, because I'm not very much familiar with the Circassian tribe, but the tribe is the Chachba. Maybe you can confirm, I don't know.
No, I don't know. I'm not familiar with the tribes of Circassians as well.
One is supposed to be from the Carbadians, which is the
Yeah.
ruling branch of the Circassians.
Yeah.
And one is from something that is spelled in Arabic, Raraik, which I have no clue to what the Circassian tribe it refers.
Can you say it again? Sorry.
And I don't even know how to read it, but the letters are something like Raraik or something like this.
There is a nation in North Caucasus called Ingush in Russian, but in their language is Ghalgai. It's like they're next, so it's first Kabardians, then Ossetians, and then Ghalgai, and then Chechens.
Close to the Ossetians, right?
They're right next to Ossetia. In their language they're called Ghalgai.
Well, this is a possible explanation.
If you even mention Dagestan, which is really east, it's like on the Caspian Sea, right? It's very far. It's the opposite side of the North Caucasus from Circassia, and Ingushetia is right in the middle. So
The middle,
yeah.
okay. For Dagestan, like I said, I think that Christian Mauder had this Achvach, so
There's this idea that the Mamluk Sultanate is named so, but when, for example, in history you have some dynasty coming from some ethnicity, they take over and establish a state for 100 or 200 years. It's usually named after this dynasty or after the ethnicity of that dynasty. Ayyubi dynasty was Kurdish people taken over, or examples like that. But Mamluk Sultanate stands out, and it's named after like the system itself. Like, is it so special? Is it really?
Let me just say that it was a development of what David Ayalon wrote about. Okay,
Yeah.
decades before I was a scholar, and I think even before I was born. But what I meant in this article is that normally you have a designation of a political entity according to its ruling dynasty, but also you have alongside it a designation that refers to the ethnic origin of the dynasty. Okay, for that matter, the Ayyubids were considered the Kurdish kings, and etc., etc. This is not unique for the Mamluks, okay? And the Mamluk Sultanate is not a term that was used by the Mamluks themselves, except for in very rare cases which are questionable, okay? They refer to themselves, the whole period was called Dawlat al-Atrak, the state of the Turks, because the Turkish language was the lingua franca, and the Turkish culture was dominant throughout the period. But they also divided the period to 2 periods, Dawlat al-Atrak, in which the first period, in which the dominant factor, the ethnic factor, was the Turco-Mongols, and the second period, Dawlat al-Charakisa, the state of the Circassians. Okay, so but here, what is special about what we call the Mamluk Sultanate is not the ethnic designation. But the fact that references to the ruling house are kind of rare. They're not, they exist, but they are rare enough. Okay? In the Turkish period, by the way, the Turkish period is from 1250 to 1382. It's like 132 years. You have to remember that a dynasty ruled for, if you want to ignore two or three Mamluks that ruled for a very short period in the middle, they actually ruled for 103 years.
Kalavun, right?
Yes, the Kalaun was a Mamluk, which ruled from the 1279 to 1290. And then his son, and then another son, Nasser Muhammad, which is probably the most famous of his sons. Not probably the most famous of his sons. And except for 3 short periods of rule, which amount to about 4 or 5 years, his descendants ruled until the end of the Turkish period, 1382. Okay? In the Circassian period, for reasons which it will take more time to explain, it didn't happen. And then you don't really find these references to the ruling house. Okay? In the Turkish period, you find references to the family of Kalaun as the ruler, except for the ethnic designation. In the Circassian period, the ethnic designation remained the dominant designation.
You mentioned earlier that you could go more in detail about how the word Circassian was used more for in general for the place for North Caucasus. Did I understand correctly or?
Yes. Labels Circassians or Charakisa in Arabic. Okay. It was definitely used in a broad sense. However, apparently, most of the Mamluks labeled Circassians were indeed Circassians. Probably. How can we know it for sure? I will tell you how we can feel it. Okay. First of all, you have few references to the other people, Abkhazians mainly, but also Georgians, Armenians. But the Armenians are not necessarily from the Caucasus; they are probably from
Anatolia.
Yeah, Anatolia, from Little. Probably. Okay. But the fact that you have some small references to the other people seems to indicate that these were the exception. Okay? Okay, and not the main. And if we know that someone was really Circassian because in the sources it is mentioned that his tribe or his specific origin, which is kind of rare, but we have some, at least for sultans. And then we hear that he had relatives and he brought many people from his village, and the whole village was empty in Circassia. Then you may assume that indeed most of the Mamluks were specifically Circassians. Okay? And one more thing, sometimes you find the names of the fathers, which are Circassian names, as far as I can understand. I don't know anything about Circassian. But maybe someone who is a specialist of the Caucasus can do more things with the research of these names. Okay, by the way, Robert Erwin wrote an article about how Circassians were the Circassians. Okay, meaning, he meant, do you know this article?
No, I haven't read it, no.
I later did read the article by Robert Irwin from 2019. In it, he argues that in Circassian Mamluk state, ethnic ties were not so essential and that the connections formed after arrival in the Sultanate were more important. But in 2024, so very recently, and this is all part of ongoing scholarship, Christian Murder, whom Professor Yosef also mentioned, wrote another article on the identity of Circassian Mamluks. There he argues the opposite and provides, at least to me, very convincing evidence. Christian Murder provides documents from the court of the Mamluk Sultan from Circassia,
whether lawyers and scientists are trying to provide convincing arguments about why a Circassian ruler should be ruling over Egypt and Syria. And here are some excerpts from their discussions at the court at that time. Then the bird of his soul, meaning his soul before he was born, before the Sultan was born, reached the clan of the Bayaziriya, who are the pillars of the rule of the Circassian kings and the notables of their kingdom. The bird of his soul did not descend on the royal house, because the kings of the Circassians do not rule over the Egyptian districts and the Hijazi regions. Neither did it descend on the common people because of the base nature of the common people among them. It made the best and most balanced choice.
Internal genealogical differences among the Circassians were apparently deeply meaningful and significant. According to our sources, it was not only Circassian origin per se that mattered when one wanted to become Mamluk ruler, but also one's precise position within the Circassian system of tribes and clans. We thus see that in studying ethnic identities of the Mamluk Sultanate, one should not limit oneself to macro labels such as Circassian, but also pay attention to how internal divisions within these macro groups were imagined and evaluated.
He meant by that when we speak about the Circassian period, first of all, we need to ask how many Circassians were indeed part of the ruling elite at that time. Okay, he thought that there were more Europeans than we assume. Okay, he was right, by the way. Okay, according to research of names that I'm doing now, there were about 20% or 15% European Mamluks in the 15th century. Okay, so it's not 100% Circassian. And then he even asked how Circassians were the majority of the Mamluks, which we assume that they were Circassians because there are references to other people. And then I'm saying that I'm assuming that indeed among the Caucasian people, the Circassians were the dominant factor. How much percentage, I cannot give you a number, but they were certainly the dominant factor.
Okay.
And then he asked another question. How Circassian they were Circassian in the meaning of the cultural meaning. Okay? And how many of them, he asked, were actually more related to the Turkish culture? They came with Turkish names or they came with the Turkish language. However, for this, I just may note, again, I'm not a specialist of the Caucasus, so that there are some references in Mamluk sources, Arabic sources, to Circassians who didn't know the Turkish language. Okay? For example, the father of the Sultan Barkuk is said to have not spoken Turkish because he was from the Kisa, which is a branch of the Circassian, which was far from the territories of the Turco-Mongols, therefore he didn't speak Turkish. Okay? And you find references to Circassians speaking Circassian among themselves. So other Amirs will not understand. Okay? Or you find references to Circassians speaking Circassian in their harem, in the private sphere. Okay? And you find references to Circassians, a general statement, that Circassians didn't speak the Arabic language as a rule. Okay? And you don't find these references concerning the Turks. My speculation about it is that Circassians didn't know Arabic as the Turks because when they came to Egypt, they didn't know Turkish. And they first had to learn the Turkish language, and then they had less resources to study the Arabic language. Okay? And by the way, because of that, they less connected to the Arab elite and forged ties with the foreign ulama, religious scholars. So it affected also their connections with the ruling Muslim, the religious Muslim elite. So I would say how Circassians they were pretty much Circassian.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to write an article about it, but who knows if I will have the time and power and so.
Folks, we do know that they brought family members over, particularly in the second half of the Mamluk period, so the Circassian period. Family members were brought over. They brought brides over and married women, and so brought brides from home. So the connections were clearly still there. We know that there's correspondence with family members that went on. So not for the first half, the second half, the connections are very, very close. And so because they seem to be older when they're recruited, the memory of home is still close, and nothing is preventing them from being in contact with people from home. So there's a preference for bringing wives over and even family if that's possible, and that's done on a regular basis. As far as the Ottomans, the question comes up, the Janissaries, if you bring in young boys as war captives, how much of their family, do they remember their parents? Do they remember their siblings? Do they remember their language? What do they remember? And this was an area of mythology and curiosity in Hungary, for example. There's a book called The Stars of Eger, and it was written in the at the turn of the 20th century, and it's been translated in different books. I've read it in English. And in The Stars of Eger, this is about the attack on the Hungarian castle at Eger, and there was a bloody battle between the Hungarian forces and the Ottomans. And one of the Janissary soldiers that plays a critical role in the battle is a Janissary from the area, so he's Hungarian. And so the question is, where's his loyalty? Is he going to remember anything of homeland, and will he be able to fight that battle? And I'm not going to tell you what happens. You need to read The Stars of Eger. It's a beautiful book.
Sources, literary sources, there is only one treatise that mentions the tribes of the sultans. Otherwise, it is not mentioned. But sometimes it's mentioned that someone was from a noble origin or from the line of Persian king. And of course, we know that at some point, Mamluk sultans developed family relations or marital ties with the Circassian nobility in the Caucasus. And people came back and forth from the Caucasus to Egypt and then returned. In this time, there was much more intense relationship between the Caucasus and Egypt.
Can you talk more about that? Did they actually have like nobility marrying each other, right?
Again, the one that wrote about it mainly was Julian Loiseau.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wrote several articles about it, and John Latham Sprinkle also knows a lot about it. I'm not the guy to ask, actually.
Sorry.
For example, you have stories about a sister. Probably the relationship was maintained through slave dealers, whatever that means. If people were actually sold as slaves because they were enslaved or because they were sent by the dealer, by their families. And you hear stories about, for example, a sister of the Mamluk Sultan, which was living in Circassia, in the Circassian homeland. And she came to Egypt just to complain to the Sultan about his slave dealer who treated her badly in the Circassian homeland. And after she made her complaint, she returned to Circassia. This is one example. And you hear about Sultan Jakmak, who forged marital ties with the dynasty. I think the name is Kutlai, or something like this, of the Circassian king. Maybe you know him.
No.
Yeah, okay. And you also hear stories about people that didn't make it in the Mamluk Sultanate, for some reason wanted to return, and then they went back to the Circassian homeland, and some of them may even later return once again to Egypt. So there was this movement all the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think it's important for North Caucasians to understand a little bit, at least a little bit, to have this notion of this connection to Mamluks.
If you're going to trace migration, and that's really what this is a topic on migration and how old that migration pattern is, and what the legacy of it is today. You can do it historically to a limited degree, but there often isn't going to be a written trace.
Yeah.
Your archaeological record is your best bet, but you've got to get the archaeologists to talk to each other, and to be able to share the information, and you need to pull in the art historians. I think those kinds of symbols go very far. What you showed me on the petroglyphs, very, very promising.
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It's really mind-blowing. You have the Kalawan dynasty symbol and then something from a...
Together.
Yeah.
Together.
Yes.
And so the designs on that pottery are of interest to us. But until then, now we've really been looking at the main part of the design, which is the inscription and the heraldic blazons. But these filler designs really don't make sense in terms of the overall design. They're added there for a reason. And they pop up every once in a while in metalwork and ceramics. I would be very curious if they appear in textiles, in carpets, if we have them in petroglyphs or anything of that sort. Those are things that would remain, that they're not in soft materials, they're materials that would last, that you could find in an excavation. You should find them in museum collections, but you need art historians, really art historians that are interested in systematically going through and looking for them.
That's a thorough research.
It would be very, all I can, is what an archaeologist can provide is we've got these little bits and pieces. Now, art historians do something with this. This is what we have. Do we have this in collections? And then you can start talking about there being connections, because at this point we just don't know. What I can tell you is that is a wasam, and that's not a Jordanian wasam, because we have tribal marks in caves and as landmarkers in Jordan. They're modern, and they could go back to the 19th century, it's true, but I've never found a match for that one.
Military, you have Mamluks, and then you have civil state, so let's say, and but how is it? How do they understand themselves? Do they understand themselves as rulers of that place, or they are? What I'm trying to say is, are they just mercenaries? Do they see themselves as mercenaries, or as do they find their identities here in in that state?
I mean, from the impression we got is that they really see themselves as the rulers of Egypt, and that this is a natural system, because they don't know another system. So you cannot, like, because our perspective from today looks at it and sees this quite strange and say that's quite alien. Why do they import people from Central? Why do they do these things? And then my reaction is also because it works, and it is a complete success. You know, they tried out a lot of things, and I mean, they thought of the Crusaders, they thought of the Mongols. The whole society works well. It works also well for the middle class and upper class, and you have an elite which comes from outside. One of the interesting thing about this outside elite is also they're not so prone to corruption so much, you know, because they don't have a cousin, whatever, to and get some money to everybody. So I think they see themselves, yes, they are God-chosen people for this one generation. And what they also don't try so much, I mean, we have seen some exception, is that they actually want their sons and daughters to be rulers themselves. So they actually accept that they have been imported for this one function, to make a career as a soldier in the state. So then they're Egyptian. Then they have to care that new soldiers come in, and they have to care that the society in itself can function without too much interference, that trade and everything is provided. And then for the Arab ulamas, the nobles of the city, the bureaucracy, they also accept it at a certain point, or they see it as their system. I mean, they criticize a lot sometimes the rulers. I mean, criticizing is very open in the Mamluk period. So there is also, I would say, like a large sense of you have the right to criticize. Yeah. So these people are installed by God in a certain way, but they are also they have to fulfill their service. Even though they fought off the Crusaders and things, but if there's a menace, their interest is really, or should be, to provide security to the society. And so I think the whole issue is not that alien. Also, if you would look at Cairo in perspective, and Alexandria, these are very cosmopolite cities. I mean, you have also other Turks there as traders, you have Persians there, you have Italians there, you have French, you have You have people from Black Africa, a lot of Black African slaves. So they don't see themselves as, like you would say,
Alien.
nation state as
Yeah.
we would see today. We live there in Cairo. We are all part
Yeah.
of this Mamluk Empire. We're all Muslims, most of them.
Yeah.
So that brings us together. Even if we're Christian, we are part of the book owners, of the dhimmis, and then we live together in these cities in separate units.
Apparently,
Okay.
like the Ottomans
So,
did, made copies
you
of
have
things,
first, you have,
and thank goodness they did. So
well,
we've
there,
got a
the
rich,
Turkey.
not legal documentation, I would call them economic documents, that for many of us form a cornerstone of our research. Thank heavens we have those. Endowment documents, for example, those are critical. And we start to get loads and loads of them. Why? That's the paper trail left from this process of what historians are calling the Waqfization of the Mamluk state, is that large tracts of land in Egypt, large tracts of land in Syria are now becoming endowed for charitable purposes and for family endowments. And as a result, they leave a paper trail. And this paper trail is a critical resource for us. It gives us descriptions of buildings that don't exist anymore, of rural, of village structure, details of what a village looked like, what its amenities were, what was income producing in a place, what had fallen into ruin, what was still making a profit. These are wonderful. What rental properties looked like, the knowledge that certain things were rental properties and not actually owned by people. You have that in the cities and you have that in the countryside. Wonderful descriptions that if it wasn't for the endowment process, we would know nothing about them.
I think we could move on to closer to your research and about the endowments. So, so the story, in short, that I understood it so far as a amateur learning is that basically you have these military systems that have a lot of expenditures. They must spend a lot of money, a lot of gold on the military and on maintaining this power. And then you have the state, which is mainly agricultural state. And then over the turn of 2 centuries, from 14th to 15th century, you have this process of slowly turning land into this endowment.
Right.
Yeah, so that means it's tax-free and it's
Right.
basically private. Yeah, so it's supposed to be dedicated to religious purposes, or to, for example, to a hospital or to orphanage or something like that. And but in reality, it becomes like a private property, and which meant that over time, more and more land became private, and more income basically went also didn't go up to the state or to the state. So is that how it? Is that
it's a complicated process.
Yeah.
The short story is that by the time we get to the period of the Black Death, so the mid 14th century, not only caused by the Black Death, there's a lot of other factors behind it, but by the time you get to the latter part of the 14th century, the state doesn't have enough in its coffers to pay the high military expenses. And this is what happens with the slave army. The slave army essentially bankrupted the Abbasid state. You get too many slaves, the army just becomes, it balloons in size, it becomes this expenditure that you can't keep up. You need money. So what does the state do? It starts selling off state property. And this happens in the mid of the 14th century, and people buy up. Anybody that has money, and it could be something small, it could be in the countryside, it could be in the cities, anything that's income producing, land, a business, a building, whatever, gets bought up, and then it's in personal hands. And almost immediately, these properties are endowed. Now, why? I won't deny that there's a charitable spirit and that some people really did want to do good things for the community. Other people, though, were looking for a tax haven. So the moment that you take private property and you endow it, either for a charitable purpose or as a family foundation, It's tax-free. When the Ottomans conquered the Mamluks in the early 16th century, one of the first things they did is they did away with the tax-free status of endowments, and they started taxing them at 10% because they realized that that was a financial liability for the state. And yes, this is one of the factors that led to an ever-growing financial decline.
And your research is more focused on Syria and Jordan.
Yeah.
And how is this process different there in comparison to Egypt, for example?
It's the same process of privatization of land and then endowment of land and properties. What's different is the nature of the agricultural land. Egypt is an irrigated regime by the Nile, and that means you've got a greater collaboration of farmers and villages, a large labor force that's needed to clean out those irrigation canals, keep them running, keep them maintained. Greater Syria, Bilad Sham, is not by and large an irrigated regime, although you have local irrigation networks like in Damascus and the countryside outside the city. That's true, but it's mostly rain-fed. And as a result, you've got localized responses to good management of water. And that's something that the state isn't going to control. It's something that's in local hands. So if I were to make a comparison between the two, I would say that there is a greater diversity and a more localized response to how to manage farmland in Greater Syria, let's say, than in Egypt. In Egypt, the state had to rely on local expertise, that's true, but an irrigation network makes you vulnerable, okay? You have to have safe conditions, the state has to be involved in some way. With the rain regime, water regime that you've got in Syria, you don't have that. And so what I do see is a little bit of autonomy. You have the same financial problems, you've got the same push towards endowing of land, but I think that there was more wiggle room for local players, local peasants, local rural elites to carve out spaces for themselves, autonomous spaces where the state couldn't touch them.
Is that also what you focus on your research on, the local response to that process? And how did they respond to those, to privatization, to what did they do, locals? Which measures did they?
Okay, it's when land is endowed for a charitable purpose that peasants tended to lose their autonomy. And one of the biggest examples of this is in Palestine with the building of agricultural terraces. That's hard work. It's hard labor, and nobody wants to do it. And so we have these legal debates about whose responsibility it is, and it's the religious elites that make the money off of it on the backs, essentially, of peasants in the period. Where you don't have agricultural terraces, let's say there's fewer of them in today's Jordan, then the state doesn't get involved and you don't have the large endowments. Most of the endowments in Jordan where you have irrigation, the Jordan Valley for sugar. You've got a sugar pot behind you. So it's the sugar industry that needed all that water. Local farmers aren't going to have much control over how water is shared. They're going to have to do forced labor and so on and so forth. Outside of those industries, you see that local communities actually have more say in what they're cropping, what they're planting, how they share the water, and the state really doesn't get involved.
And where in that process is your research now focused? For example, archaeological work that you do currently, and where right now is which are the current trends in the research, so say, or I don't know, where do you think the research will go? Yeah.
Okay. In May, we were back in the field in Jordan for a short season, and we did something we'd never done before. We excavated at the Tell, where the castle is, in some of the houses of the village below the castle, and we had half of our team working in the Wadi Hispan, doing a study and excavation of some of those agricultural terraces that we were just talking about. And we're getting dates. We do laboratory analysis of the soils. We find out when those terraces were built, when they were maintained, when they went out of use. And we're also studying what was planted in those terraces and in those fields. These were fields that we believe from historical records, and we believe archaeologically, were the fields that belonged to Talisman, not the cereal fields, but the gardens that belonged to Talisman in the Mamluk and Ottoman periods. And so what we want to understand now, and this is something I've done not only at Hispan, but at other sites where I've been doing field work, is to study how fields develop in tandem with how a settlement develops, and to understand if we can use that as a window on the way the state either did or did not involve itself in local society. And I think what we're going to see, and this is what I'm predicting, is a greater autonomy in Bilad Sham than you had in Egypt.
I want to ask about Mamluk art and architecture. Famously, they became patrons. Mamluks became patrons of extensive and building projects.
Yeah.
All over Middle East. And today's medieval Cairo is to a large part from Mamluk period.
Yes.
And why didn't they do that, and how it come about? Yeah.
Okay, that's part of that growing movement towards endowments. So what the money comes from, largely from endowments.
Oh.
So they're not just tax havens, but they actually, the endowment system helped to finance urban development in all the major cities, Aleppo, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, but really everywhere. And so that money creates the financial foundation to build the building and to provide the services behind it, which then gives jobs, employment to people, provides various services like education, and so on and so forth. And it wasn't just the sultans, emirs, the officers did the same. Anybody with any money, merchants were active. And in the countryside, it was the rural elites, tribal leaders, the local preacher, the local businessmen that owned a bakery and whatnot. These people were able to transfer some of their wealth into services that their communities really, really needed. And they left a building trail, in their communities. So that's why you have so much of this. And there are, if you look at a Waqf document, a Waqfiyya, that document will tell you very specifically how to maintain this building and what to do with it in the future. And there are laws, regulations, according to different madhabs of Sunni Islam, on how to regulate those endowments, right? It depends, there are differences between the different schools of law. But this is why those buildings are still standing. They're not supposed to be demolished unless they become a hazard. So they're meant to be kept up so long as the endowment, the financial endowment behind it, can financially do that. So that gives them a solid financial foundation for posterity. You can keep that building going. So Cairo is an amalgam of what was built in the Mamluk period, what was built in the Ottoman period, and kind of mixed together. And keep in mind that it's really that endowment system that's behind them. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So they try to, so to say, monopolize centralize the income, and that's they centralize the income. That's where it goes.
There's a couple reasons for it. Again, it is a tax haven. Second, you found whatever is the financial support for that building, whether it's a farm or a business, cannot be confiscated by the state. Of course, it was all the time, but by law, it couldn't be confiscated. That's one way of, and you make your children for posterity, forever and ever and ever, the manager of that endowment, and that provides an income that your children wouldn't otherwise have if you're a Mamluk, right? So this is a way of bypassing taxation and confiscation of property. But there's other good things that are meant. It's a way of investing in your particular neighborhood to provide water, to provide a school for the kids in your neighborhood. So it was everything. That was the driving force behind urban development from the 13th century on in most Muslim cities, was this endowment system. And then it also brings honor to your name. Look at all of the endowments and the good that you've done. There's that aspect too.
Have this unsustainable military structure on top of the population which is trying to be autonomous or
Right.
gets some autonomy on the margin of the country, and then you have its decline. It comes decline, and the question is it inevitable in that? Is it inevitable to have this decline? So in the 15th century, Ottomans take over. They have this battle, then where Ottomans win, and then take over Mamluk Sultanate. But before that, you had the high inflation, high corruption, Black Plague. And then the spices trade went around Egypt. So when the sea routes were discovered around Africa, so they no longer had this high income from spice trade
Right.
from India. So all these factors, did that mean that the decline, the collapse was inevitable, or what was the condition of the state, let's say, right before the Ottomans took over? Yeah.
I don't think so. I think it could have been staved off, but a couple of decisions were not made that needed to be made. First of all, you can't maintain such a large number of slave soldiers, right? That is what bankrupts the state. It's just not financially sustainable. What you can have is a professional army, and you could have a slave corps in that. So it would have required military restructuring. Another thing is they couldn't keep up with the armaments of the Ottomans. They were using cannons defensively. They refused to use rifles except to arm one African unit. And it was only one sultan that even experimented with that at the very end. Too little, too late. So they were behind in terms of military organization and military technology. Had they tried to innovate a little earlier and not been tied to what was a medieval system of warfare and a very expensive one, they could have lasted longer. The other thing is there were some sultans in the late 1400s, late 15th century that tried to reform the financial system. They tried to take back some lands that had been endowed, to create a new sultanic bureau, financial bureau, from which they would have funds to use as needed. They tried. So there were attempts of financial reform, but they weren't maintained. So I think that there were many of those factors. It was just too little too late. The other thing to keep in mind is that I don't think a state like what the Mamluk sultans had could ever have been a global force. It wasn't structured. It was a regional power, right? The Ottomans were global. And it's because they were able to conquer the whole way across North Africa, gain large parts of the Mediterranean, push across the most of the Middle East except for Persia, move into Central Europe. I mean, it's an enormous chunk. It's Roman size expansion. And if you compare that to what the Mamluks did, the Mamluks at some point just said, Egypt and Syria, that's it. I mean, we can have people that send us money in tribute, and that's fine. They had a special relationship with Yemen, a special relationship with Cyprus, for example, but they weren't an expanding power. That was a regional power. So at some point, if a regional power and a globalizing power come into conflict, that regional power is going to have to cave.
So on their refusal to innovate, I say one of the sultans tried to incorporate new weapons and new ways of doing war, and then in inertia that is what part of the regime. It was due to the fact that it's part of their identity. They are knights, right? They are soldiers. They are to train the whole life to be to have good skills with bow, within swords and so on. So when the Sultan tried to innovate, he basically had to outsource that to hire to establish a completely new unit, right? With a cannon.
Put, exactly.
Yeah. So and their refusal to innovate was because it endangered what they are, right? It was part of what they are. They are these elite swordmen and elite bowmen or riders, horse riding. So that was what made them what they are, right? Their skills.
Right.
Yeah, so it was inevitable for them that they wouldn't they wouldn't innovate, basically. They wouldn't incorporate
You would
cannons.
have to eliminate some of the old guard and recruit new guys that are trained from the beginning with to use rifles. I mean, it would have one unit would have to replace the other, and there would be bloodshed. It would not have been an easy transition. That would have been a really difficult transition. And you're right, this is part of an issue of identity. Yeah.
And then after the collapse of Mamluk Sultanate, this process of enslaving soldiers and having elite slave soldiers is continuing throughout Ottoman period and right until 19th century, right?
Right.
So is it true that it was? Can you talk about a little bit about that?
The Janissaries were recruited differently, and so the Janissaries were recruited from non-Muslim areas that are conquered. And again, you can't technically enslave a Muslim. So these, because the Ottoman Empire was expansionist, that made that system possible, right? So rather than to tap into a slave market, they used their own conquests to absorb new blood into their military system. And they were well trained. The Janissaries went to the best schools. They learned languages, just like the Mamluks did, actually. But they were trained to use modern methods of warfare and modern technology. So there'd be a difference. The Janissaries were also similar to the Mamluks, probably to a greater degree, brought into governance. And so they became very active in governmental roles as well. It's a different system, though, who becomes Sultan. So it's not this, you come through the ranks of the Janissaries to become a Sultan. No, you've got dynasties. The Ottomans had dynasties. And that's probably the most important glaring difference between, is that you have a very important military core that's of slave origin, but it's not meant to be self-replenishing and replace the Sultan. The Sultans are not recruited from that.
We will have to start here somewhere in the mid-15th century. And already at that time, the Mamluk Empire was there for 170 years. So very big success story, I mean, to my eyes. I mean, it's a very long sultanate. And they have shown that they are capable of reforming the system at several times. So they have adjusted to the plague. They have done a big land reform at the beginning. And also in the 15th century, they start reforms. And then they also attack Cyprus, so they get a lot of money out of that. When I think one of the decisive points is the taking of Constantinople by the Ottomans. So at that point, the Mamluk Sultan, so say it in the sources, he was happy, like he made a happy face, but then he went into his room and he was very worried what could happen now, because it was clear that once the Ottomans have taken that, the Black Sea would be dead. So what does this mean? The import of Mamluk soldiers becomes far more difficult. You have now to treat with a northern Islamic power to let you these slaves through. So that's some of the things. And also the Ottoman power becomes stronger, also financially. So they now need more money to defend themselves for the coming battle with the Ottomans. They're quite clear that it will come, because you have an expanding Ottoman Empire, which is declaring itself more and more as we are the leading Muslim power. So for being the Muslim power, they need to attack the other Muslim powers for being the strongest power. And they also want to control Mecca and Medina, which of course is the heart of the world, of these Muslim world. So the Mamluks are quite aware of that, and they are soldiers, so they have a soldier thing. So they say, okay, what do we have to do? We have to put more money into the military. And that is the counter side, which you just described in terms of inflation, having higher wages, having much more money into the military. They have to, because they Ottomans do the same. So now we are in a race of armament. And on the same side, then you have the Safavids coming in the beginning of the 16th century. So another foe from the east. So it's somehow as the heirs of the Ilkhanids, only that the Safavids become as Shiites. They are also challenging the Mamluk superiority. So saying they also want to become the new rulers and the leaders of Islam. So Mamluks have to prepare against the Safavids and against the Ottomans. The Ottomans come increasingly with firearms. Firearms are very expensive at the end of the 15th century, and the Mamluks don't have firearms. So what to do? Mamluks try to copy what the Ottomans have, and they also try to attract European experts. These European experts do not come for free, so also more money. Then what to do if you don't have wood? One of the big problems of the Mamluk Sultanate is they don't have forests. They have some forests in northern Syria, but in Egypt it's quite difficult to build a fleet or to build cannons or these kind of things. You need forgery, you have to import a lot of these things. Who has a lot of that? The Ottomans. The Ottomans have forests, the Ottomans have silver, the Ottomans have bronze, the Ottomans have copper, they have everything, and the Mamluks have not a lot. So it's very costly for the Mamluks to be in this race against the Ottomans, and this is perceived by the contemporaries as a very harsh situation economically, which is understandable, because but for the Mamluk, for the military mind, they completely do the right thing. They reform the military. They don't want to lose. I mean, they are there to maintain the Sultanate and to provide security, and for doing so, they have to increase the military budget up to a very stronghold. Of course, this is quite difficult for the society as it's all, but it works, to my eyes, quite well until the end of the 15th century, because they are capable. They have some fighting in the 1490s in Anatolia, which the Mamluks come out not that bad, but it's still a bit problematic, because one of the problems the Mamluks have is they don't have a navy, but the Ottomans have a navy, and they have a navy with cannons. So this navy with cannons can control all the roads the Mamluk take to the north, because most of the roads of the Mamluk Empire going to the north are just besides the coast, which the Ottomans can shell with the cannons. So that is quite difficult for them. And on top of that, the Portuguese sail around the Cape of Good Hope. And then the Mamluk Empire, you hear this, and then Ibn Yas describes this and say they have destroyed the wall which Alexander the Great had built against the people of Gog and Magog, and now really the world is upside down. The Portuguese come from the wrong side. What are they doing in the Red Sea? What are they doing there? They're supposed to be in the Mediterranean. That's where Europeans belong. Well, what are they doing there? And as we said before, the Mamluks have no navy. So now these Portuguese are there, and they're threatening Mecca, Medina, and they're threatening the Indian trade. And the Indian trade is one of the backbones of Mamluk income, especially in the times where the Mamluk need all these monies to fight the Ottomans and the Safavids. So there comes another threat towards the Mamluks. So the Mamluks try to build their own navies, but they fail. It does not work well. At a certain point, after 1507, they first of all they asked European powers, please help us. Yeah, we need that. And they ask especially the Venetians, because the Venetians used to be somehow their allies and help us. I say, hey, the Portuguese, you don't want them to get your trade. And the Venetians say, yeah, we don't really want them to get our trade, but we are there. There has been the war of Georgia in northern Italy. The Venetians at that time also have limited possibilities. Okay, so that's a problem. So at the end, the Mamluks have to ask the Ottomans, with whom they are actually more or less in very big problems around the region of Anatolia, for help. And then the Ottomans help them. in a certain while to build a new fleet in Suez and in Jeddah, and then they have some success against the Portuguese in Aden, so they fight off an attack of the Portuguese at Aden, and they somehow stabilize the situation for trade for the time being. But this is around 1510, and then with all this help the Ottomans give the Mamluks, they find out where's the weak points of the Mamluks, where they, and then suddenly then they say, not that suddenly, but they prepare their attack by saying, we think that the Mamluks helped the Safavids against us. Okay. So they are plotting, the Mamluks are plotting with the Safavids, and because the Safavids are Shiites and enemies of Islam, the Mamluks also are enemies of Islam, and we have to conquer the Mamluk Sultanate in order to fight the Safavids. So that's the ideological plot. There's not much to that, but it works. And at that time, the Ottomans are prepared, and the Mamluks cannot withstand the final attack 15, 16, 17. And I would say not so much about corruption, but also because of the sheer power and size of the Ottoman army at the time. The Ottomans are just far superior in numbers, equipment, and the rest. And the professional Mamluk soldiers are still very heavy. I mean, we have these reports, can really inflict a lot of damage, but they cannot hold the Ottomans. So there's at the beginning of the 16th century, there's too much at hand. The Mamluk Sultanate is not capable to fight off all the enemies at all fronts, especially because they had deliberately not built up a fleet during their reign, which is difficult because in Syria, Egypt, not so many forests, but they've never had that. But in the 16th century, it turns out you need a fleet because Europeans are everywhere. Yeah, Europeans are, that is the age of colonialism is starting, and the sea is the place where this is going to happen. And if you don't have a fleet, then it's very difficult for you to participate in that. Also trade and other things. So that leads more or less to the downfall then. Yeah.
Them the downfall of the Mamluk Sultanate, but until up to 19th century, you have more similar institution all over Middle East. For example, Janissaries in Ottoman Empire, and in Egypt particularly, you had Mamluks stayed there even after the end of the Sultanate. The elite was until the 18th century. Is that right?
Yeah.
So this is it? Can we say that this institution was there until for 800 years or so?
It was, yeah, and that shows how successful it was, because it was still kept. And the interesting thing is, when the Ottomans conquer the Mamluk Sultanate, they actually chase and kill a lot of Circassians, and everybody who still dresses as a Circassian is killed. So there's a lot of killing going on.
What did it mean to be dressed as a Circassian? They had a distinctive look that made them stand out from the other groups in the Sultanate. Because of this, we can even identify them in some works of art from that time. For example, in a painting by Venetian artist Bellini from 1507, set in Circassian-era Alexandria, there is a group of people in the right corner wearing red hats called tsamts. This was typical Circassian headwear. We see the same thing in another famous painting from 1511 showing the reception of Venetian ambassadors in Damascus. Again, the red tsamt hats appear and mark the figures as Circassians. If the importance of ethnicity is still debated by scholars today, it seems like it was not in the time of Ottomans. They treated Circassian identity as something important enough to target people who dressed like them. So if someone stopped wearing Circassian clothing, they were probably a bit safer.
But then the Ottomans, after around 20 years after their installment, a lot of troubles coming with everything, then they decide, like in other regions which they conquer, they said we have to keep the local costumes or the local standards. And for them, the Mamluks and the slave trade and the people coming there, this is Egyptian. Yeah.
Okay.
So that is local behavior. So we have to continue local behavior. We bring in people from the Caucasus, we train them, at least, but in less numbers. It's not thousands, and sometimes we speak about 20,000, which we have at the same time. So the numbers are far less, because you need these Mamluk troops, or neo-Mamluk troops, as they are called sometimes in scholarship. You don't need them to fight off another big power. You need them more or less as police force or as regional force and these things. But they keep importing them for the especially Egypt, and they are still called Mamluks. Beside that, you have then the Turkish Janissary troops. So another a sort of elite troops, which the Turkish recruit in the Balkan region among their Christian population, which is much cheaper for them because they don't pay for them; they just take them in. So actually, it's quite illegal in terms of Islamic viewpoint, because these people should come outside the Dar al-Islam. But the Ottomans just say, oh, the Balkan, we just conquered it, so it's still not really Muslim.
Okay.
So that's why these have to give us young boys as tribute all the time. So they get this, and but the institution of military slavery was apparently so successful that it stayed on. And that is something which we have to bear in mind looking at it from our viewpoint today. I would say that things which actually work well are kept until they don't really make sense anymore. So in the 19th century, you have national states. Slavery is stopped in general by especially European. The British Quaker movement and others, they say that's a bad thing. You cannot own other people. So when that stops, then also military slavery becomes negative. And also in the age, then in the 19th century, when you have these very huge national armies, where you have the leverage, where every people has to go into the army, because people are now putting millions on the ground. And with the technology, you don't really need these super specialists anymore, because, and that's also one of the problems, of course, of the Mamluks at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. I mean, there are these really war machines on these horses. They can fire 6 arrows a minute. I mean, they are really great on these horses, but any idiot can come with a gun and kill them. With training of 1 or 2 weeks, and these guns get better and better. So the skill a normal soldier needs becomes less and less. The training of these new armies is more about working together, like really, or following instructions, not as being so strong individually.
We are closer to the end. We are already past 1 hour. I will just ask a couple more questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Exactly what I wanted to ask. So you have in the 19th century, Napoleon comes to Egypt and has a huge battle with Mamluks, and he writes that 2 Mamluks beat 3 French, but something along the line of 1,000 French can beat 1,500 Mamluks. So because of they're better. Of course, Mamluks are better trained individually, but on a more bigger scale, they cannot withstand. And that's really the end of the Mamluks, as we know. And then you have Muhammad Ali taken over in Egypt. So what happens after that? Is it completely? Are Mamluks completely gone? Are they no longer any more? Today, no more people who can trace themselves back to them.
There's still people who say we have off-Cherkess families and these things. Of course, they are there, and they used to merge with the local elite because they had a certain standing until the early 19th century. We still have some, import was going on until the 1820s, 30s of these Mamluk soldiers, and then we get a European trained army. More and more Arab local people enter into the army. But out of this Turkish Ottoman elite, which was also under Muhammad Ali there, you still have traces. You can find Ottoman people with Ottoman names and these things. And if you would talk to Egyptians now, they would say, yeah, he's from a Cherkess family. Oh, yeah, he's from a Cherkess family. So that is still there in the mind. Although these people, they are Egyptian 100% now after this, and there was no more flow or input of Turkish-speaking families, especially after the Arab nationalism of under Gamal Abdel Nasser from the 1952, and then it should be very Arab and Egyptian Arab. But you find traces. Of course, you have the whole buildings, you have the ideas, you have the stories about them. And somehow they merge with the Ottomans, so it's not 100% clear. If you speak now to some Egyptians, what about the Mamluks, and then they say, no, they were, and then are they bad for Egypt? Yeah, they were bad, but sometimes they were good, and then it's very ambiguous what they say about them.
It's like from today's understanding, it's very strange. It's really strange way of doing a state, right?
I'm not sure about if strange is the best
word. From our perspective.
Yeah, but from our perspective. But we were not living there.
Yeah.
We don't know what 400 years from now people will say about our being. For them, it was normality. And as I said, it worked perfectly. And maybe it worked even, perfectly maybe, but it worked well. And for inhabitants, maybe being in that point, there was not so much inner strives as we had it in Europe at the same time. So people were maybe even more in peace under Mamluk rule than they were in other regions of the world at the same time. So I think they delivered well on their contract with the society. They were imported for defending the realm and for providing peace and security, which I think they could do quite well. They coped with a lot of crises. Only at the end, 15th, early 16th century, there was too many crises, so they lost the plot. And that is because the end was, of course, a very striking moment. That is what we always look at history from the end. And then we try to understand why did they fall down, what did happen, but would you be in 1510 Cairo? You would think, oh, we are still good in the game. We don't know. Oh yeah, we have some challenges, but we will go through that. 5 years later, you're gone. Okay, that's it.
So a couple more things. Just interesting stories about this era. So and examples of people with Mamluk heritage, not Mamluk, but Circassian heritage. So, for example, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of England, his grandfather was Minister of Interior, I think, before the revolution in Ottoman Turkey, and his mother was of Circassian descent, and so then they migrated to Britain, and then there is a book about Leonardo da Vinci's mother, that she might have been a slave, 16-year-old from Circassia, and so you find these types of examples here and there. Do you know?
Yeah, I know. I didn't know about Leonardo da Vinci, but I'm not surprised because one of the things is what we also see in Kaffa is that most of the young men in the medieval period, also from Circassia and early modern, they are sold to the Islamic world, but many of the women are actually sold to southern Italy because they're white slaves, and because we are still in racial also societies, although I said before that, of course, there were mixed societies, but they had racial hierarchies. Yes. So a white slave from Circassia, she has the highest price. And you can also have a child with her, which does look like you. So it's not, it's not that you have a black bastard or something. Okay. So so that also makes a difference. So so racially, these these slaves, especially female slaves from Circassia, are very much in demand in the high society all over the Mediterranean.
Yeah, you have saying Circassian beauty, right? In
Yeah.
Turkey. Yeah.
In Turkey, and also in, I mean, I don't know if you have the same, but we know that many of them were, for example, sold to Genoa,
Okay.
and then to Italy and to Spain to be concubines there.
Even after Mamluks period, the Ottomans used people from Caucasus as military. So even there was Georgians ruling Iraq, not ruling like some Georgian, like how you say it, like the Turkish appointed Georgians in Iraq for like 100 years in the 18th century, and Napoleon fought. Yeah, sorry.
They started as governors, yes.
Yeah, and Napoleon fought Mamluks near pyramids, allegedly. So in already.
The Albanian governor of Egypt.
Yeah. So this practice took place for like thousands of years of people from North Caucasus going all over Middle East, basically, even like after Mamluk Sultanate. I find it's interesting that in North Caucasus, people don't know actually about it. Not often. They don't know. That's why I wanted to make this video.
Yeah, as for the Mamluk period, the transfer for Circassians, this is also a debate, a scholarly debate. Why was there a transfer from Turks to Circassians? Okay. Some would like to emphasize the fact that Barkuk was a Circassian, and when he was the first ruler in the Circassian period, and when he came to rule, he preferred to bring his fellow Circassians in order to diminish the importance of the Turks. And some, that is the demand factor, okay? And some would like to emphasize the supply factor. Hannah Barker, for example, she researched not only the Mamluk sources, but also European sources, documents concerning the sale of slaves to Europe. And she found that exactly at the same time, when the Turco-Mongols were starting to disappear from Egypt, they also more or less disappeared in Europe and were replaced by Circassians and Russians. Okay. In Europe, the documents concern domestic slaves, and not slave soldiers. Okay. But I think that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Okay. I think that Barkuk, after he was deposed for a short period, he could not trust any longer the old Turkish elite, and he started pushing his Circassian Mamluks. And this is the demand factor, and the supply factor in Egypt was a little bit different than in Europe, because in Egypt there was an importance to the fact that around the time of Barkuk, the Islamization of the Golden Horde, of the inhabitants of the Golden Horde, the Kipchaks, yes, was more or less complete. And as you know, it's not allowed for a Muslim to enslave a Muslim. Okay?
Does that confirm that Circassians were not Muslim then?
No, they were mainly Christian, Orthodox Christian, and this is why the Mamluks had to look for a different source after the Islamization of the Turco-Mongols, and they went one way to the Caucasus and the Circassians and other Caucasian people. There were Russians, but we don't hear about them so much in the Mamluk sources, in comparison to European sources, where there are a huge amount. And the second direction was Europe, and then Europeans become also a source. So this was the motivation beyond the transfer to the Circassian ethnic group. Okay, there was also a supply thing. But in Egypt, it was much more significant than in Europe because of the Islamization of the Turks. And there was also a demand thing.
Thank you so much for your time and for your effort. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Now we'll briefly go through the architectural heritage of the Mamluk Sultanate, which includes some of the most important monuments in Cairo today. For example, the Mosque Madrasa of Sultan Hassan, who was a Turkic Mamluk. There is the Mosque of Sultan Al-Muayyad, who was also a Turkic Mamluk. And as an example, the hospital complex of Sultan Qalavun from 1285. The citadel of Quwat Bey in Alexandria, built in 1479, was constructed by a Circassian Mamluk. This citadel stands on the same site where the ancient lighthouse of Alexandria once stood. Then there is the Madrasa of Al-Ashrafiyya in Jerusalem, located right next to the Temple Mount, which was also built by a Circassian Mamluk, Cairo. The Circassian Mamluk Quwat Bey also constructed one of the minarets of Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, and as well one of the minarets of Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo. Mamluks also carried out a great deal of construction in Palestine. For example, several bridges there were built by Sultan Baybars. So there is a very significant architectural legacy from the Mamluk period all across the Middle East. And now I want to briefly go through a list of key heads of states who came from the North Caucasus in the Middle East and beyond. We already talked about 25 Mamluk sultans from Burji dynasty. In addition to them, 9 Ottoman sultans had Circassian or North Caucasian roots, mainly through their mothers, because Circassian women were often wives and consorts of Ottoman sultans. One of the last Ottoman sultans was Mehmed VI. During his time, his Minister of Interior was a man called Ali Bey, who also was half Circassian through his mother. He was actually lynched by a crowd during the Young Turk Revolution, and his family later escaped from Turkey. His great-grandson eventually became the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. His name was Boris Johnson. Another sultan was Mehmed V. His mother was Circassian, and she was one of the most influential women at the Ottoman court, and for example, initiated the construction of Dolmabahce Palace and the Galata Bridge in Istanbul. She was also known as one of the most controversial and corrupt figures of the late Ottoman elite. 5 Ottoman Grand Viziers also came from the North Caucasus. One of them was Mahmud Shevket Pasha, who in the final years of the Ottoman Empire became one of the most powerful political leaders. He served as a Grand Vizier during the period of the Young Turks, together with the 3 main leaders of the movement, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha. Jamal Pasha's mother was also a Circassian. These 3 figures led the Young Turk government and were responsible for major events of that time, including the Armenian genocide. Beyond the Ottoman Empire, 2 Shahs of Iran had Circassian mothers. The King of Hijaz, which is today Saudi Arabia, also had a Circassian mother. One of the queens of Jordan was from Circassia. There was also a Prime Minister of Jordan, 3 Prime Ministers of Egypt, Prime Minister of Iraq, Prime Minister of Tunisia. We mentioned him before, Khair al-Din, even appeared on the Tunisian currency. Prime Minister of Libya, Prime Minister of Turkey, Prime Minister of Malaysia, a President of Turkey, and Prime Minister of Great Britain we talked about before. I also want to briefly mention the Abaza family. For the last 150 years, they have been one of the most prominent aristocratic families in Egypt. Many poets, actors, politicians, and public figures come from this family. I also want to show a list of consorts of Ottoman sultans, just to illustrate how many of them came from the North Caucasus. You can see in this table their places of origin. Many are from Circassia, and one even is from Chechnya. In the later centuries of the Ottoman Empire, a large number of the sultan consorts came from the Caucasus. Finally, I want to talk about the concept of Circassian beauty. In the 19th century, the beauty of Caucasian and especially Circassian women became something of a global myth, particularly in the United States. Many beauty products were marketed using this idea. Advertisements would say that if you use a certain cream, you would become as beautiful as a woman from Circassia. So this image of Circassian beauty became a popular marketing concept. In addition to that, literal Circassian beauties became a part of an exhibition. In New York, we displayed many different kinds of people from all around the world. very tall people, for example, very short people with unusual physical features, and so on. These kinds of exhibitions were quite typical for the 19th century. In that particular exhibition in New York, Circassian beauties were also presented to the public. So these are some of the photographs. They had very unusual hair, not at all typical for Circassians. Here they are with some of their colleagues.
So this show took place in the 1860s, but this topic was in people's mind for much longer. Even during World War I, at the end of it, US President Woodrow Wilson asked Army Chief of Staff, which was positioned near Caucasus Mountains at that time, to submit him a report about Caucasian women and their beauty. And this request was taken seriously, and a parade of 70 Circassian women was organized for US Army officials, and a report about their beauty was sent back to the president. This obsession actually goes back to the 18th century, when a German scientist, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, published a book in which he divided humanity into 5 races. In that book, he argued that white people originated in the Caucasus region and labeled them the Caucasian race, which is still used as a label for white people in America today. Blumenbach himself didn't intend this idea to be racist or used as a propaganda, but over time it absolutely was. It was treated as a so-called proof of white superiority, despite having nothing to do with the real science. But the less known detail is actually that the actual skull that Blumenbach used as his example of a Caucasian race, was actually a skull of a young Georgian slave girl. That's all that I wanted to talk about. Thank you for watching.